All right, let's talk now in this section of the chapter about sort of the overall structure of the nervous system and how we kind of organize it into different subsections and what those subsections are responsible for doing. So let's go ahead and look first here at the overall structure of how we organize this. So we generally split the nervous system into two main sections, that being the central nervous system, which is comprised of the brain and the spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system, which is comprised of things like ganglion and nerves, and really the rest of our body and the rest of the nervous system components within our body that are not the brain or the spinal cord. And so we can break these down a little bit farther and kind of discuss this. We'll come back to the brain a little bit at the end of this section and kind of break down those components. But let's first start by kind of talking about the peripheral nervous system and seeing how that breaks down and what these sections are responsible for. So the peripheral nervous system, again, splits into multi-components. First and foremost, the main split is between the somatic nervous system, which we can see here, and the autonomic nervous system. And so the main distinctions between these two things is that the somatic nervous system is something that we have a little bit of control over. It has a lot to do with sort of our muscles and things that we actually have active control in how we interact with it. So we can control our muscles, we can choose to sort of move and alter them in different ways. And you can see also how this sort of connects and ties into parts of the central nervous system as well. So we can see that this system is also kind of responsible for that connection point between the two. Then we have the autonomic nervous system, which is, automatic, things that we don't actually control or have active sort of, awareness of what's going on. And so the autonomic nervous system then splits into two subdivisions again as well, that being the sympathetic division and the parasympathetic division. And the way these two things work is sort of like when our body is being active versus when it's being at rest. And so we can think about the sympathetic division as sort of like our fight or flight, right? It activates in times of, heightened activity. And we can see sort of this, increased activity levels through this sympathetic division. Whereas our parasympathetic division is more about sort of maintaining that calm, maintaining that reduced activity level, and things that happen during that period of time, like digestion or sort of cardiac heartbeat that is still going on even when our body is at a more reduced, relaxed state. So these two things work together to kind of balance us out. And when we're in a state of being more active, we might have more activity in our sympathetic division. And when we're in a state of more rest, we might have more activity in our parasympathetic division. Let's also talk now about the sections of the brain and how these kind of break down and are organized. And generally speaking, we could dive into this much farther than this, but I want to start and focus primarily on sort of the main regions of the brain. And the main four regions of the brain, or the main four lobes of the brain, or at least the outer cortex, are the frontal lobe, which we can see in red, the parietal lobe, which we see in blue, the temporal lobe in yellow, and the occipital lobe in green. And these four different lobes are actually separated by very specific divisions within the brain. And this is one really cool thing that I actually remember learning and kind of thought was really cool when I learned it. But I think when you think about the brain and its kind of lumps and bumps and things like that, you might think that everyone has like a unique structure of their brains, almost like a fingerprint. And this actually isn't the case. So we know that the mapping and the actual bumps of the brain are very, very similar from one person to another. And we've actually traced and mapped what each individual bump and valley is responsible for and what that has to do with its function. And so I found this really cool when I learned it, just that everyone's brain actually has a similar structure to everybody else's. And so what we call these bumps and grooves is we call the bumpy part of the brain gyri, and we call the groove part of the brain sulci. And so this would be the gyri, and this down here would be the sulci. And so these two areas we can see, the central sulcus right here is, again, this groove, this region that's this valley between the two regions. And then we can see something, for example, like the postcentral gyrus or the precentral gyrus as these larger lumps that we see in these parts of the brain. And so, again, I just find it really cool that everybody's brain is really the same. And so we can actually map what these specific things do in one person to another. And so when we're looking at these different regions and talking about them, we see things like the frontal lobe being a big part and primarily responsible for things like higher level thinking, personality, more of these unique humanistic characteristics. This is also a part of the brain that we have that's much larger than other species. And so we see a lot of those, again, intelligence and higher level thought come from things like the frontal lobe. The temporal lobe down here in yellow has a lot to do with memory and auditory signals and things like that. Language is here as well. We have things like the hippocampus, which again is responsible a lot for memory formation, and these happen again in this temporal lobe. The parietal lobe up here in blue, a lot to do with sensory information, our senses feeling like areas of our body have a lot to do in this parietal lobe. And then finally in green, the occipital lobe down here, a lot to do with vision. Vision is the number one sense that we use to interact with the world. And so we have a very large portion of our brain devoted to understanding what vision is in this case. And so these are the four main lobes of the brain. And so just understanding generally what each does and each is responsible for, I think is helpful to kind of get an idea of this. Like I said, there's a lot more we can get into, a lot more deeper portions, which we're going to talk a little bit about here as well. So one other really kind of important piece of the brain and how this works is called the reticular activating system, or the RAS. And this generally is responsible for kind of controlling and sending information where it needs to go. And so we get a lot of information from our eyes, our ears, from all of our senses about the world. And that information needs to be diverted and sent to the correct place to be able to be interpreted by that place. And so the RAS is responsible for kind of diverting and sending signals to the places that they're supposed to go. We can also talk a little bit about the limbic system and what this is responsible for. And we see a lot of this have to do with sort of like regulating our body and talking about a lot of these regions of the brain, like the hippocampus, the amygdala, the thalamus. A lot of these regions have to do with things like memory or fear or fight or flight, things like that. The amygdala, primarily a lot to do with fear. The hippocampus, a lot to do with memory. And these are just regions of the brain that are deeper within that structure and have more, specific functionality.